and welcome to the Disability Connection podcast. I'm your host, Laura Best, one of DLC's intake specialists. The Disability Connection is produced by the Disability Law Center. The DLC is the protection and advocacy agency for Massachusetts. We are a part of a national network of disability rights agencies investigating abuse and neglect, as well as providing legal representation and other advocacy services to people with disabilities within the state of Massachusetts. DLC's website is www.dlc-ma.org. Today, we have Matthew Steele on the podcast, one of DLC's staff attorneys. Matt is going to discuss his role on serving on the Accessible Housing Special Commission. He will also be discussing the recent commission report, which outlines recommendations for the Commonwealth to address the shortage of accessible and affordable housing. Matt, it's so good to have you on the podcast.
Thanks very much, Laura. I'm really happy to be here today.
All right, so to get us started, can you tell us a little bit more about your work at Disability Law Center?
Yeah, I'm happy to. As a staff attorney, I do a mix of direct representation for clients who call us with various disability-related legal problems. I've also been able to do a lot of different policy work, primarily in the housing area, providing public comments on different state proposed plans and documents. And then I would say the third category of work that I do a lot with is monitoring and investigations related to abuse and neglect. That could be everything from visiting a state mental health hospital to reviewing records for people who were injured or worse in a facility.
Mm-hmm. And before our call today, I took a look at DLC's advocacy materials on reasonable accommodations on our website. I send those out a lot for folks who contact us who need a better understanding on how to actually make a reasonable accommodation. Did you have any hand in writing those?
I may have written one or two of those. I'm glad that you're using them as part of your role in the intake department. We do provide a lot of technical assistance to clients. Not everyone needs to have full representation from an attorney at DLC. A lot of the times people just need to know what the right law is that applies to the situation and what language to use when they approach a landlord, a property management company, whatever it is that they're facing. DLC has a ton of plain language resources on pretty much any area of disability law. They're written for people who are non-experts, family members, advocates, and consumers. I've focused mostly on the housing ones, but I look at them myself to refresh my memory when I'm looking at client problems that I haven't seen in a while. So the ones that are up there right now in housing have to do with reasonable accommodations, reasonable modifications, which is closely related, and assistance animals. There's even a couple sample letters that we work with clients to help them draft their own advocacy materials.
You really are a specialist in housing law. And I just want to reemphasize that for the podcast. And, going back to the self-advocacy materials, the sample letters are really, really key in, because you need medical documentation that outlines, your need for the request, the reasonable accommodation request. To get us oriented into the housing universe, which is what we're going to be talking about today, does the American with Disabilities Act apply to public housing or subsidized housing, such as Section 8?
Yeah, thank you, Laura, for saying that. Do have a bit of experience in housing law. I've done kind of everything from eviction defense to reasonable accommodation to policy work, but I don't pretend to know everything about everything. It's a huge world, and there are people who do housing day in and day out all day long, whereas at DLC we do a broader mix of issues.
Right.
That's regarding your question about the ADA, it comes up all the time. Um, what I try to steer people to for housing is the Fair Housing Act often because
Mm,
that's going to apply to pretty much any kind of housing, whether it's public, subsidized, or some hybrid. Whereas when you're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, the real thrust of that act is for employment and public accommodations, whether they're private or government places
Got it.
to go. There are aspects of the ADA that absolutely apply to housing, particularly hard units of public housing.
Hmm.
The Fair Housing Act also applies equally as well to public housing. So you kind of can't go wrong by citing to the Fair Housing Act. Of course, there are some exemptions to both the ADA and the Fair Housing Act when you're getting into smaller, mom and pop owned, triple deckers and things like that. We're not going to go into that level of detail today. We could do a whole
Yeah.
podcast on that.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
pretty much, generally speaking, the Fair Housing Act is your best bet when you're talking about disability discrimination, requesting reasonable accommodations and modifications, and things like that.
Interesting. Interesting. That's really helpful context. So let's talk about the special commission. How did that first come to be? Was this funded by the Commonwealth?
In many ways, it was this all came about because of the Affordable Homes Act of 2024, which was a landmark piece of legislation brought by the Healy administration. The commission itself didn't just come out of nowhere. It was a product of advocacy by different independent living centers. Our very own Brianna Zimmerman, who works in our voting rights program,
Right.
was previously at Stavros Center for Independent Living in Western Mass, testified in support of the bill, and she was among the people who suggested having a commission to look at people with disabilities in housing while the Commonwealth was reaffirming its commitment to increasing housing production and doing a lot of really good things to address the affordability crisis in housing, uh,
Hmm.
and trying to make sure that the disability community didn't get overlooked in that process. So the commission was really led and organized by the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. Uh,
Hmm.
I'll refer to that as EOHLC, sometimes as HLC. It used to be the Department of Housing and Community Development, DHCD.
Ah,
In the
okay.
housing world, yeah, there's a ton of acronyms in the housing world, and I'm going to try my best to avoid using them during our chat today, but it's unavoidable in some instances. So EOHLC is led by Secretary Ed Augustus. He was also a commission member. He convened also two other commissions it's worth mentioning. One was for housing related to people who are what is known as extremely low income, and
Hmm.
the other one was for senior housing, which is very much a hot topic these days.
Yeah.
Each of those commissions issued their own separate reports. Sometimes the recommendations were nearly identical and overlapping. So reading them, all three of those reports together, with a cup of tea is a useful activity, I think, for a lot of people who are interested in this stuff. It really was a great process being on the commission. We had a ton of support from EOHLC staff, everything from scheduling to thinking through some of the issues to mediating some of the harder recommendations that we were grappling with, and also getting in local and really national experts to do presentations to all three commissions to get us started and kind of grounded in the area that we wanted to focus on. So basically, once we had a few of those initial meetings and expert discussions, we broke up into smaller working groups to form specific recommendations. We would bring those back to the larger group, discuss
Hmm.
them, tweak them, and then eventually the really hardworking staff at EOHLC turned those recommendations into the report that was issued at the end of December 2025.
Interesting. And your role specifically, what was that?
Great question. I was one of 11 commissioners, and we all represented not ourselves personally, but the organizations that we work for. So I was really honored to be participating on behalf of the Disability Law Center. We had state legislators, Rep. Haggerty, State Senator Sear, housing advocates, people from the development community, and we all kind of met from March of 2025 through the end of last year to get this report done.
That's what a really diverse group. And I appreciate that it was taken from a variety of perspectives. Obviously, I think DLC's seat at the table is extremely important as the protection and advocacy, but to have developers as well as legislative members, that's really key. Was it difficult to find consensus among each other?
You would think so. From my perspective, it was surprisingly easy, the whole process from start to finish. And really all of the decisions and the recommendations were done by consensus. There were one or two instances where we had to have some smaller groups get together with EOHLC staff to iron out some differences.
Sure.
But Secretary Augustus from the get-go made it really clear that he wanted this commission to do as much as it possibly could to promote housing for people with disabilities, but not to the point where it would prevent buildings from going up, because
Hmm.
the state is under a tremendous amount of pressure right now to produce affordable housing and to produce more housing. So
Yeah.
marching orders were pretty clear, and I think people that helped focus people on majoring in the majors. Um, I learned a lot, just personally from being able to interact with a lot of people from different housing realms and thinking about all the different factors that go into the production, particularly of affordable housing, um, from the time that you're selecting a site to thinking about whether you need to tear a building down versus trying to rehabilitate it, and
Hmm.
all of the challenges. Got a flavor of some of the challenges in putting together the financing for these deals,
Yeah.
which sounds like it's just never easy.
Yeah.
So
Never
yeah,
easy.
there was a bit of a sense from some parts of the developer community that any additional requirements that are added related to disability or environmental impact and things like that is just going to make their life harder, and it's really hard already to get these projects done. But I
Hmm.
think we kind of kept everyone's interests in mind to the best that we could, while pushing for our constituency, which is people with disabilities, particularly with mobility related issues, in the context of this commission, and got a lot of good recommendations into place. Getting things built is really hard. Costs are up to over $500,000 per unit for most developments, pretty much
Whoa.
yeah, anywhere in the state. And it takes a special commitment from developers to move forward with projects when the costs are as high as they are.
Yeah.
And um, we tried to keep that front of mind. So I mentioned that we did divide the commission up into smaller working groups. We focused on specific subject areas. In the final report, if you have a chance to peruse it, you'll see that there's four different main topics that we addressed. One, first and foremost, was housing production. Number
Hmm.
two was housing preservation. How do we keep the existing housing that we have and make it more accessible to people with disabilities? Number three, access and navigation of the system. And number four, language and data modernization. We'll be able to talk about specific recommendations that came up in those areas in a little bit. Um, but the commission really wanted to focus on increasing the supply of accessible and adaptable housing, preserve as many units as we can, make improvements to searching for housing for people with disabilities and getting, basic information about what the resources are that are out there for this community, and
Hmm.
also looking at modernizing some of the systems that we have to apply for housing and find affordable, accessible housing.
Again, I really appreciate the all-encompassing approach that the commission undertook for, to help our listeners understand, the scope of the challenges. Could you give us a sense of what that was like in the commission?
Yeah, we took, a broad look at some of the numbers to start out with, and again, the data is not perfect in this field, but using very rough numbers, we're talking about approximately 800,000 people in Massachusetts living with some form of a disability.
Hmm.
Of those 800,000, more than 300,000 have a mobility or ambulatory limitation. So
Hmm.
it's a very large population, and we to the best of our knowledge, think that there's only about 10,000 affordable, accessible units throughout the entire state. So we know off the bat
Oh,
there's not
yeah.
just not enough housing.
Yeah. Just not enough.
And then the housing navigator, which we'll talk about a little bit more, is a really on the forefront of helping connect people to affordable housing through its website and search functions. They are estimating that there's only one accessible affordable unit for every 63 renters in the state.
Whoa.
And there's just, a lot of the recommendations that we're making are going to help, but it's going to take years and many efforts from many different corners to increase the supply of affordable, accessible housing. There's no real quick fix to the situation that we find ourselves in. Um, I don't think this was your particular intake, Laura, that you handled. I think it was someone else at DLC, but last year I had a case where a mom of a young child had to carry him up the stairs to her second floor apartment because she couldn't find a wheelchair accessible unit. He was a young man who most of the time had to use a wheelchair to get around. So, our work was really informed by some really hard cases like that. And,
Yeah.
um, you know, these people should hopefully understand that the recommendations in the report aren't coming out of a vacuum. They're coming out of real human stories like that one. And we reached out um, to independent living centers to ask them for input on the recommendations. We talked to fair housing organizations, and I know the developer community was also regularly consulted regarding some of the specifics that we came up with.
Mm, yeah. And yeah, I don't think I did the intake, you know, on that specific case, but that's a perfect example of what we're working with in Massachusetts. You know, unfortunately, that's a story I've heard from lots of different people, you know, whether it be, two flights of stairs or four flights of stairs. It's distressing, the limited number of fully accessible housing units. And again, I'll just plug the readability of the report. Uh, You guys did a really, really fantastic job creating something that was informative, but not inaccessible to a general reader. Could you give a couple of examples, though, of some of the recommendations in the report?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. The very first recommendation in the report was related to housing production. I think it's one of the most important ones that we came up with. And I'm really happy to report that there's already been some movement toward fulfilling it.
Mhm.
Is that we wanted to help create a pipeline for more wheelchair accessible units. So the recommendation is that on any project that is new construction that has state funding behind it, let's go from 5% accessible units to 10%. Let's double the number of the supplies so that we don't have people in the situation that we just found ourselves in.
Yeah.
Uh, as part of the Affordable Homes Act, Massachusetts was committing an additional 200 million per year to support affordable housing. It seemed like a great time to look at the minimum requirements and try to do more than that. So
Mhm.
really happy that there was support for going up from 5 to 10%. Again, that's not something that happened in a vacuum. Advocates have been asking for that goal to be increased for years. We just finally had the momentum to do that. And we're looking at the vehicle for how to make that happen. It's a wonky process called the Qualified Allocation Plan. It has to do with low-income housing tax credits, things that would take up multiple podcasts to try to wrap our heads around. So we're not going to do that today.
Yeah,
But
makes
um,
sense.
the great thing is, because ELC was staffing the commission, they were in a position to effectuate a lot of the recommendations. And, that's the good news. The bad news is that it takes years to develop affordable housing from the ground up.
Yeah.
So, we're probably realistically 3, 4 years away from those units being occupied by people with disabilities. But
Mhm.
again, it's going to take a lot of long-term thinking and planning to address the affordable, accessible housing crisis. And this is just one concrete way that we thought we could do it. Um, so that's a production related recommendation. What about preservation? We focused a few different recommendations on Massachusetts state public housing system. I didn't know this until recently, Laura, but we're one of just a handful of states that has its own state-funded public housing. Most of the states rely entirely on federal dollars to have their public housing, but Massachusetts has a really robust public housing system of its own. So we wanted to look at some kind of low-hanging fruit within state public housing, and we know that public housing authorities every year have to go through an annual planning process. So
Mhm.
we made a couple recommendations that said, hey, as you're going through this annual planning process, which you're already required to do, let's just add a couple things related to disability. So that we could be planning and budgeting for improvements related to accessibility, because unfortunately a lot of that public housing was built well before the ADA, well before the Fair Housing Act, well before current Architectural Access Board regulations. So
Yeah.
they're just not up to current standards
Yeah.
of accessibility. So we said recommendation 2.3, for example, was conducting self-assessments by local housing authorities of state-funded public housing, looking at the scale and condition of accessible units, and things like how to better allocate your annual funds to do site improvements that would help people with disabilities navigate. Because we know that a lot of the people, particularly in state-funded, it's called elderly disabled housing.
Hmm.
Um, you have a lot of folks with disabilities and mobility impairments.
Yeah. I I had no idea Massachusetts is one of the only states that funds its own housing program. That's really unique. So we were just looking at the production and preservation of housing for people with disabilities. What about the access and navigation piece?
Great point. We don't want to be building new accessible units if we don't have a way of getting people with disabilities into those units. So we had a few targeted recommendations that pertain to the Housing Navigator, which I mentioned earlier. It is the place to go if you're looking for affordable housing in Massachusetts. It is
Mm-hmm.
also the place to go if you're looking for accessible housing in Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Also had some recommendations that related to, just having a one-stop shopping place for people looking for accessible housing. Because right now, there's very helpful bits of information on, for example, the state has a Massachusetts Office of Disability. They were also on the commission. They've got
Mm-hmm.
resources on the website, their website. EOHLC also has some really helpful resources for people with disability on its website. So does Disability Law Center, but there's no one centralized resource that you can go to kind of get all the answers to your questions. And we're just kind of relying on people stumbling their way onto the right website to get answers to the questions that they have, and they may or may not get there. So we're talking about trying to get some resources to have a singular website that would house all the information that people would need, and possibly be able to interact with folks in the way that Chat GPT and some of these other artificial intelligence programs are getting people better information a lot faster now.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to talk about application and people having to gather various documents just to apply for housing. There's a
Right.
centralized, there has been some progress in this area. It hasn't really gotten us where we want to be with a centralized housing application for public housing, a
Mm-hmm.
system called CHAMP. So there was, recommendation related to making some improvements to that. Little things like right now under state law, you're if you're a landlord and you have a wheelchair accessible unit, you're required to hold it open so that people with mobility impairments can apply for 15 days. Well, what if that period could be extended to 30 days?
Yeah.
That would allow people with wheelchairs more time to find out about it and apply without putting the landlord at too much of a disadvantage, just 2 additional weeks.
Yeah.
So hopefully, some of these recommendations will land, and we'll see some, again, small scale solutions to a much larger problem.
But I think when you take it from a small scale perspective, that snowballs into larger systemic impact. And of course, you mentioned this earlier, the data piece is really important. So, what has the commission how is the commission addressing the data piece?
Yeah, it is really important. I don't think we were able to come up with a silver bullet type of solution for that, but we have a couple recommendations that are on point. And I think, as technology is evolving, like these solutions should become a little bit easier to manage. But
Hmm.
there's things like, we were relying in the past a lot more on federal level data from the Census Bureau and the CDC and or organizations that seem to be in a little bit of, disarray right now. And Massachusetts has been, doing some cross-agency efforts through programs like Advancing Health Equity and Massachusetts Initiative, and looking at tying in our healthcare system to the housing world. But there's no really easy way to go about revolutionizing the way that we're collecting our data. But
Hmm.
just to take a more concrete example, we can certainly tell you roughly how many accessible units have been built over the last 10 years in the state with state funding, but no one right now can say what percentage of those units are actually occupied by people with disabilities, when those units last turned over, how many people have lived in them, things like that. The
Huh.
occupancy data is a bit of a black box right now. So all these sites, that are funded through state funding that are not public housing, they're privately managed. They
Hmm.
report their vacancies to the housing navigator, but they're doing that on a voluntary basis and not necessarily reporting to anyone on the nitty-gritty details of occupancy status. So we do live in this high-tech era right now, and we know that large property companies are using software to manage their operations, but we don't really have the tie-ins, the reporting requirements, and things that we would need to kind of have more real-time data of units that are online, coming online, or where we would need to target, which areas we would need of the state we would need to target to build more units with disabilities. So, um, more units for people with disabilities, excuse me. So, um, companies too are reluctant to try to seek out disability-related information from tenants because tenants are often protected by fair housing laws from disclosing too much information about their disability. So it's a really tricky area to operate in,
Yeah.
and I wasn't necessarily part of the data working group on the commission, but they made some good recommendations on how to try to thread the needle with getting better data on the need for units, the demand, and the occupancy of those units.
Mhm. Is there anything else that you want to add about the report?
I would just mention that a few of the recommendations in the report are specifically things that would need the legislature to act on, so require, a change or an amendment to an existing law. And that takes a lot of work and a lot of time. I think I mentioned already the keeping a unit open from 15 to extending that period from 15 days to 30 days, that would require an amendment to Chapter 151B. Another one that comes to mind is there's a recommendation in the report about a law that's really, kind of unique, and I think we should be proud that Massachusetts, for larger landlords with 10 plus units at a site, requires the landlord to pay for the cost of reasonable modifications so that a person with a disability can live in their unit or use a common area and go about their life living and minimizing the impact of their disability on their housing. We thought, well, hey, why not extend that law a little bit and make that apply to landlords that have five operate buildings or sites with five or more units?
Yeah,
That would, UHLC crunched the numbers and said, well, that would bring in another 120,000 units potentially into this, under the umbrella of this
whoa,
section of the state law. Yeah, yeah. So hasn't happened yet. Would be great if it did. Not
yeah,
all of those 120,000 people, of course, are going to need reasonable modifications, but a certain percentage of them will. And
sure.
a lot of people with disabilities paying really high rents aren't in a position to pay for their own reasonable modifications right now.
Certainly, certainly, especially if it's, a wheelchair ramp or a stair ramp, it can get really complicated and just frankly extremely expensive.
Absolutely.
I just want to reiterate how all-encompassing the commission and the recommendations have been formatted. Housing is a really complicated issue, and what the commission has done is taken a look at it from really unique, different perspectives. Obviously, the Commonwealth must dedicate more housing towards accessibility, but the commission's also considering the finding of the housing, which is equally important, as well as the data collection. Because the commission is so future oriented, how do you think the report from December 2025 will be applicable in 10 or 15 years?
I think the best case scenario would be that all of the viable recommendations, and we'll know relatively soon which ones are and which ones aren't, are well in place over the next 5, possibly 10 years. And then at that time, we'll be ready to have a new commission to tackle the next set of issues, of which there's sure to be something. Uh,
Yeah.
I think it was a great idea to tie the commission to the Affordable Homes Act, which created funding for some of these things that we've been talking about. And
Mhm.
whenever there's a kind of really large piece of legislation with funding behind it, it would be great if we could have a commission. It may not happen, but at least consider that as an option. There's obviously a lot of uncertainty in the world right now, but
Mhm.
having done this work for a while, I can say that there's a commitment at pretty much every level of in the state to create more affordable, accessible housing. Population is getting older. We don't want people ending up in nursing homes who don't need to be there.
Yeah.
And my personal hope is that in 10 to 15 years, we can do a lot better job using technology to match the supply with the demand. That's everything from applying to subsidized affordable housing, managing waiting lists, tracking locations, connecting people to the specific features of units that they need, and making sure that we can transfer tenants from units that they don't need, so
Mhm.
that someone who needs the features of the unit can get into them. We could do a whole other podcast, Laura, on all these ideas, and it was really great chatting with you today.
And I certainly think we should do more podcasts on the housing universe. It's so interesting. Unfortunately, that is our time for today. Matt, I just wanted to thank you again for coming on here, talking about your experience, the commission, and the recommendations of the report.
My pleasure. Once again, it was a fantastic experience being on the commission, and I hope that anyone who's listening has an opportunity to check out the report, which you can find by searching for the EOHLC Accessible Housing Commission report.
And this show will be available on our website and as a podcast. Please follow us on all of our various social medias and check out our website at dlc-ma.org. Once again, that's www.dlc-ma.org for the links.